In August the 9th, 1936, 85 years ago today, Jesse Owens won his fourth gold medal at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Leni Riefenstahl's famous film, The Game, seems to show Hitler storming out of the stadium. But was that really what happened? Well, like most things, it's much more complicated than that. Like most things in history, it's much more complicated than that. Albert Speer...
A bit more nuanced.
Albert Speer, although, of course, remember, Speer, not exactly the most reliable witness at the best of times, said Hitler was highly annoyed by the series of triumphs by the marvellous coloured American runner Jesse Owens. People whose antecedents came from the jungle were primitive, Hitler said, with a shrug. Their physiques were stronger than those of civilised whites, and hence should be excluded from future games. Well, I mean, he's on message there, isn't he?
It's pretty consistent.
Consistent. But in October that year, Owens said himself, some people say Hitler snubbed me, but I tell you, Hitler did not snub me. I'm not knocking the president. Remember, I'm not a politician. But remember, the president did not send me a message of congratulations because people said he was too busy. Yeah, I mean, this is going to lead to lots to talk about. Interestingly, Owens was allowed to travel and stay in the same accommodation as the white American athletes while in Germany. But when he attended a reception in his honour back in New York, he was not allowed to enter the Waldorf Astoria through the main doors. Instead, he travelled up to the reception in the freight elevator.
Fascinating thinking back on those Berlin Olympics, which are, they're the kind of one of the most famous games of all, aren't they?
Well, notorious, or infamous.
Yeah, infamous.
Although, I mean, and everyone knows this though, is that so much of the sort of iconography that the Olympics has now comes from the 36 games anyway. Well, and the Nazis put themselves on best behaviour, didn't they? Basically.
Yeah, completely.
Because they knew the world was watching. So when you read that Owens was allowed to stay in the same place as the white athletes, that's basically Germany thinking, look, the German government thinking we don't want to attract attention to ourselves right now, not when the whole world's watching. It's when they're not really looking and we can lie and obfuscate. But when the world's actually watching, we have to behave ourselves, basically. So, which implies, of course, that they knew what they were doing was wrong.
You've been to Berlin a few times, haven't you? Have you ever been to the Olympic Village?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
And it is absolutely amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, you sort of go in there and look at that stadium, and you're there, and you half close your eyes, and you absolutely can see that. Yeah, Leni Riefenstahl.
Well, but also, I mean, it shows what one of the games, one of the functions the games has, although it's not its intended function necessarily, is that governments get to use it, don't they? They get to exploit it, and and show how magnificent they are, or how efficient they are, or how reasonable they are, or whatever, like So the Australians used it to show how into sport they were, mate, and the Chinese demonstrated what you can do if you don't really care about human rights. I mean,
and Britain used it to show that we're completely over our imperial hangover.
Because we've slapped an enormous bandage marked NHS on it. Yeah. Basically.
But it is interesting, and the point about Jesse Owens not being allowed to use the front door of the Waldorf Astoria is a really neat one, because of course, Britain and America and the Dominions, they go to war to uphold freedom and the rights of man and the common man and democracy and all the rest of it, and yet you have
whatever that means,
whatever that means. But I mean, you've got horrible segregation in the United States. You've got all sorts of racial issues. You've got Britain and its increasingly uncomfortable imperialism. Yep. So you've got all sorts of problems.